Hi! On the Woodpecker today, the vanity is coming along pretty nicely. I managed to glue everything I did, plus I make the doors. Our new vanity is well underway, but it's far from being finished. Now I need to cut both dividers. And just like for the bottom, I begin by taking care of the edging. Place the dividers in place, mark their length, and cut them. This will look just like that. But before going any further, I need to mark the dominoes placement and cut the mortises. I have a bunch to drill, but before I can glue all this together, I need to make the final sanding on the inside of the plywood. Now I can begin gluing this. First, I glue the back to the top. After spreading some glue on the joint, the mortises, and the dominoes, I put both pieces together. I want this to be square, so I add 4 wooden squares and clamp all this to my workbench. When the glue is dry, I glue one side, and again, I spread glue on the joint, mortises, and dominoes, so I can put the first side in place. Next, I add a lot of clamps. Then I can do the same thing for the other side. Before the glue sets, I scrape the excess glue inside the cabinet and leave it to dry. When it's dry, I try the bottom and separators in place. But to keep both separators at the right place while the glue dries, I cut 2 scrap pieces of plywood to keep them in place. With those two, the separators will be at the right place. But to do this, I mark the center of the cabinet and the center of the spacer. Align both marks together and clamp them in place. Now I'm able to glue all this together. I begin by spreading a bit of glue inside the rabbets and on the back frame. Then I lay the bottoms in place. Next, I spread glue on the separators and put them in place. Finally, I use a lot of clamps. Since I don't want my spacers to stick to the cabinet, I add some right angle to the other side and remove the spacers. Next, I temporarily add some screws while the glue dries. After checking that all the clamps are okay, I leave this to dry. But after removing the clamps the next morning, I noticed that the back is not glued to the separators properly. And because of that, the plywood can move. I fix this by drilling some holes through the solid maple and into the plywood. In each hole, I add a dowel and cut the excess. I put 3 dowels in each side of each separator. Next, I start to work on the base. I begin by ripping some boards to the right height of the base. The front and both front sides have a mitered corner, so I make the 45-degree cuts first. Next, I mark and drill the mortises. Then I dry fit those 3 pieces and mark the back mortises and cut them. But after another dry fit, I notice the center is a bit too flexible for my taste. I cut a stretcher for the center. Now that I'm happy, I disassemble it, spread glue on the joints, and clamp the base. Now I can finally start to work on the doors. I begin by ripping all the wood for the rails and stiles. When I have enough, I cut them to size. All done. Now I can hold the doors in place with clamps and mark where I'll cut the dominoes mortises. And you might have noticed that the one near the center is farther away from the side than the others. This is because I need space for the groove I'm going to cut. After all the marks are done, I cut the mortises. Since I don't want to goof up again, I mark the grooves placement and cut them. Before cutting them, I double check if I'm okay. All the rails are cut right through, but not the stiles. I begin after the mortise and stop before the next one. When it's done, I can take the measurement for the inside panels. And for once, this wood is ready. It's the first thing I did when I started the project. But I need to cut the V-grooves. I'm going to use this opportunity to hide the glue joint. So I begin by marking what I need to rip off from the distance of the glue line. I do that for all the panels. Then I can move my rip fence to each panel line and rip the first side. Next, I can move the rip fence to the width of the panels and rip them. I now have all my panels. I need to make the V-grooves. After cutting all the ones that are near the side, I move the fence up until the bit is in the center of the glue line and cut the rest of the grooves. Then, just like for the big side panels, I make a rabbet in the back. After checking that this will be perfect, I make the final sanding of all the places that will be difficult to sand after the glue up. And finally, I can glue the doors. For doors drying. And while the glue dries, I can begin to work on the moldings. The first thing I do is to plane some boards to the thickness of my moldings. Then I route a half round on both edges of each board. Next, I rip the bull nose. The last thing to do is to cut a rabbet. Okay, I should have enough moldings for the job. Now that the glue on the door is dry, I can cut them to their final dimensions. First, I put 2 doors in place and make sure one edge is lined up with the inside divider. On the other side, it's what I need to remove. I begin by measuring what I need to remove. Divide this in 4, mark the doors, and cut both of them. When I put them in place, it's not perfect. I fix this with a plane. When I'm happy with them, I do the same thing, but for the height of the doors. When both pairs of doors are done, it's time to sand the glue squeeze out. Now come the hinges. I begin by marking the center of the hinges hole. When it's done, I drill all the holes on the left. After each hole, I check if the hinge will fit. I do this for the 4 doors. Then I move the step and repeat all this for the right hinges. When I'm done, I mark the inside of each door. Since each door is a little bit different, I don't want to mix them up. But before putting the doors in place, I have to take care of the bottom of the cabinet. Okay, after putting the cabinet like it should be, I can return to the hinges. I begin by drilling some pilot holes for the hinges screws. Then I screw them in. The first screw is a charm, but when I screw the second one, this couldn't have gone any worse. Now I need to remove the broken screw from there. Using a small chisel, I remove some wood around the screw, so I can take the pliers and remove it. I take care to keep the hole square. Now I just have to plug it with a piece of wood. But since this is the first hinge, I can continue to work on the other side. But from now on, I'm going to use a normal screwdriver to screw them. Now I can install both right doors. With an open back, this will be so simple. But the doors have to stay put, so I clamp them in place. Then it's as simple as drilling pilot holes and screwing the hinges. When I'm done, I remove the clamps and adjust the doors. In no time, I have 2 functional doors. I need to do the same thing for the other 2. But before, I need to finish to repair that small hole, which was barely big enough for pliers. At least this mistake doesn't show at all. I just need to do the same operations I did on the last two doors. And after a little while, I have 4 functional doors. And the first thing I do is to remove them and lay the cabinet on its side. Now I can sand the rails and stiles to their final grit. Then I cut the moldings. I begin with the first 45-degree cut. Then I measure its length directly on the cabinet and cut it. But those cuts are just in the ballpark. For accurate cuts, I clamp a square on my sander. And each end is sanded at exactly 45 degrees. I check the fit, and since it's still too long, I return to the sander. One done. 3 more to go. When they fit well, I remove them and sand them a little. Next, I put a little bit of glue and put them in place. When they're all glued in place, I put as much weight on them as I can. While the glue dries, I can start the same thing on the doors. But before cutting the moldings, I remove the weight and scrape off the excess glue before it has time to settle properly. Then I finish the door. And just like for the cabinet itself, I put as much weight on it as I can. The next day, I turn the cabinet and do the same thing on the other side. But now I'm a little scared that when I scrape off the glue, I scratch the wood. So I resand again. Since I have the sander in my hand, I soften the door's edges a little. Finally, the doors are done. But I'm far from being done. If you want to see what I do next, you'll have to come back to the Woodpecker.